and a very warm welcome to all of you listening. You join me today as we continue on with our brief series looking at some of the Bible's lesser known or unlikely heroes. Today we'll be looking at the fascinating and rather gruesome story of Jael. Our reading is taken from the book of Judges, and I'll be reading verses 11 to 22 of chapter 4. So this is Judges chapter 4, verses 11 to 22. Now Heber the Kenite of the children of Hoab, the father-in-law of Moses, had separated himself from the Kenites, and pitched his tent near the terebinth tree at Zananim, which is beside Kadesh. And they reported to Sisera that Barak the son of Abinom had gone up to Mount Tabor. So Sisera gathered together all his chariots, 900 chariots of iron, and all the people who were with him, from Harosheth Hagoyim to the river Kishon. Then Deborah said to Barak, "Up, for this is the day in which the Lord has delivered Sisera into your hand. Has not the Lord gone out before you?" So Barak went down from Mount Tabor with 10,000 men following him. And the Lord routed Sisera and all his chariots and all his army with the edge of the sword before Barak. And Sisera alighted from his chariot and fled away on foot. But Barak pursued the chariots and the army as far as Harosheth Hagoyim, and all the army of Sisera fell by the edge of the sword. Not a man was left. However, Sisera had fled away on foot to the tent of Jael, the wife of Heber the Kenite, for there was peace between Jabin, king of Hazor, and the house of Heber the Kenite. And Jael went out to meet Sisera, and said to him, "Turn aside, my lord, turn aside to me, do not fear." And when he had turned aside with her into the tent, she covered him with a blanket. Then he said to her, "Please give me a little water to drink, for I am thirsty." So she opened a jug of milk, gave him a drink, and covered him. And he said to her, "Stand at the door of the tent, and if any man comes and inquires of you and says, 'Is there any man here?' you shall say, 'No.'" Then Jael, Heber's wife, took a tent peg, and took a hammer in her hand, and went softly to him, and drove the peg into his temple, and it went down into the ground, for he was fast asleep and weary. So he died. And then, as Barak pursued Sisera, Jael came out to meet him, and said to him, "Come, I will show you the man whom you seek." And when he went into her tent, there lay Sisera dead, with the peg in his temple. This is the word of the Lord. Before we look at the story of today's unlikely hero, Jael, let's spend a few moments reviewing last week's unlikely hero. Last time we looked at the story of Moses' father-in-law, Jethro, or Yithro in Hebrew. There may be some who would quibble about his inclusion in a list of biblical heroes, and it's certainly true that his heroic or great act is not comparable to other biblical heroes. He didn't, at least as far as we know, participate in epic battles or defeat numerous foes, nor is he recorded saving people from certain death or fighting wild animals with his bare hands. However, his acts of kindness, consideration, and wise counsel warrant, I believe, his inclusion as an unlikely or lesser-known hero. Scripture presents him in a favourable way. He is portrayed as being a wise, pious, and godly man, who held God in proper awe and reverence. One aspect of his wisdom is reflected in the fact that he understood that human beings derive strength and support from the people around them. In particular, we all need the love and encouragement of our families. When we don't receive this, we can feel lonely and isolated. Jethro therefore recognized that Moses would be far happier and much healthier with his family alongside him. Jethro therefore worked towards family unity. He brought his daughter Zipporah, Moses' wife, and his 2 grandsons to come and join Moses. He also correctly identified where Moses, whilst doing the right thing, was doing it in the wrong way. It was good and right that Moses felt responsible for the leadership of the people. God, after all, had called him to lead, guide, and judge the nation of Israel. However, this was just too much work for one 80-year-old man. Jethro counselled him wisely and advised him, after first seeking approval from God, to appoint additional helping judges. These lesser judges, working of course under the authority of Moses, would take on the less important judicial case. This would naturally free up Moses, and it would allow him to handle just the most serious issues. Jethro then, the efficiency expert, taught Moses an important lesson in managing our priorities and of course in delegation. In this one simple piece of inspired counsel, many problems were resolved. And I would argue that this alone was a great act, and hence warrants Jethro's inclusion as an unlikely hero. Today we will look at a very different kind of heroic act. This one certainly took courage and resolve. It's an act that few of us could ever contemplate emulating. Today we will look at the story of Jael, a woman, as we shall see, who certainly makes her point. We find ourselves today in the book of Judges, known as the Shoftim in Hebrew. The book chronicles a fascinating period of Israelite history, which lasted for around 300 to 330 years. This accounts for about 30% of the total history of the nation of Israel that's covered in the Old Testament. In terms of the actual biblical characters involved, it spans a period of time stretching from the death of Joshua until the coronation of Israel's first king, Saul. When Joshua died, God did not appoint a person to succeed him as the military and political leader of the entire nation of Israel. This was because each tribe was expected to conquer and occupy their own allotted territory. There was, therefore, no need to have a national leader in place. Unlike all the surrounding nations, Israel would exist without an ongoing succession of kings as national rulers. This, of course, made the nation of Israel unique. The nation of Israel was expected to live and operate with God ruling over them. We refer to this as a theocracy. God wanted them to place their full and complete trust and faith in Him. Any time spent reading through the book of Judges will highlight that this was not exactly how things transpired. The book is mostly a record of abject failure. Throughout the book we see a similar pattern repeated time and time again. It's a four-step cycle of sin, servitude, sorrow and salvation. The cycle begins with the people being faithful to God. This obedience to God is all too soon neglected, and the people fall into sin. They turn their backs on Him and begin to worship and serve Baal, Ashtaroth, or other pagan gods. God punishes this falling away by allowing enemies to come and enslave the nation. Servitude. The nation of Israel then recognizes its sin and cries out for God's mercy. Sorrow. God hears their cry for mercy and sends them a judge to lead them to safety. Salvation. The people are grateful to God and come back to worship Him accordingly for a time. But it's never long before that cycle begins again. So who were these judges and what function did they serve? When times of national crisis arose and the people needed a leader, God in His grace would provide one. This person was known as a judge, and they would rise up, complete their mission, and then fade away into obscurity. When we hear or use the word judge today, we conjure up a particular image in our minds. We might think of someone dressed in black, possibly wearing a funny wig, presiding over a courtroom. The Old Testament judges, however, did far more than simply dispense rulings in legal cases. In fact, they actually seem to have done very little of this. So what function did they serve in Israel? Well, I've read them being described as a mixture of a mayor, a marshal, a prophet, and a general. And this description, I think, aptly describes their multiple roles or functions. If you desire a simpler way to think of the judges, you can simply envisage them as being those sent by God to save or deliver the people from their enemies. Why, you might wonder, were so many judges required? But the reason that so many judges were needed was that the people were so often beset by their enemies. And this was because they had disobeyed God's command to fully conquer the land. Instead of defeating and driving the Canaanites from the land that they had occupied, they made covenants or pacts with them. Instead of demolishing the pagan altars, they allowed them to remain. And this meant that when they turned away from Yahweh, these altars could be utilized in their worship of false gods. This should provide us with a sobering lesson today. We must be radical in our attitude towards sin and sinful practices. We only fool ourselves and set ourselves up for failure if we foolishly think that light and dark can coexist at the same time. The story that we will consider today is that of Jael, and she lived at a time when Deborah was the judge of Israel. Deborah is often connected with the military commander Barak, and we'll look at him later. But let's begin by spending a few minutes looking at Judge Deborah. Deborah, whose name means bee, was the fourth judge that we see emerge in the book of Judges. She is sandwiched between Judge Shamgar and Judge Gideon. We are told that as well as being a judge, she was also a prophetess and the wife of Lapidoth. She is unique as being the only female judge, and she is also in very limited company as being a named female prophetess. She joins a very short list with Miriam, Huldah, and Noadiah. She is then, I'm sure you would agree, a very interesting person, worthy of study in herself. You can read her story in full in Judges chapter 4 and 5. As you begin chapter 4, you will note that there is very little preamble regarding how Deborah came to be a judge. We are simply told that she was judging Israel at that time. I mentioned in my introduction that the judges did little actual judging of legal cases. However, in Deborah's case, she did operate as a judge or arbiter between the people. And she chose a very interesting place in which to sit and make her rulings. We read that she would sit under a palm tree, located somewhere between Ramah and Bethel in the mountains of Ephraim. The people would come to her and ask for her to rule on their disputes. We should also make a note at this point of what was occurring in the nation of Israel at this particular time. The people had, not surprisingly, again fallen away from God, and as a punishment God had allowed an oppressor to arise. The earlier oppressions came from outside of Canaan, but now a leader within Canaan was permitted to rise up against the Israelites. This was King Laban, who ruled and reigned from the city of Hazor in northern Galilee. The original city of Hazor, located around 10 miles north of the Sea of Galilee, had been burned by fire by Joshua's army almost a century before. However, since that time it had been reoccupied and rebuilt by the Canaanites. It was, at the time of Deborah, a large and fortified city. Its strategic importance lay in its location on the main road connecting Egypt and Mesopotamia. King Jabin was assisted by his military commander Sisera. The name Sisera is not a Canaanite name, so scholars speculate that he may actually have been a Philistine. He, along with his forces, was based in the town of Harosheth Hagoyim. We are unsure of the exact location of this town, or maybe it was even a city, but it was most likely situated in the western part of Galilee. The people of Israel had lived under the oppression of Jabin and Sisera for 20 difficult and tough years. The reason that the Canaanites were so comfortably able to suppress Israel for so long was because of their awesome military might. They possessed 900 iron chariots, and this was precisely 900 more than the Israelites had. The chariot was the most advanced weapon of that day. It was, I suppose, the equivalent of a battle tank today. It gave any army using them a tremendous advantage, especially over an opponent that could not bring their own chariots onto the field of battle. On a wide open battlefield, in dry conditions, the chariot was almost invincible. They were, though, far less effective on hilly, rocky or wooded terrain, and definitely in wet conditions. In the wet, the horses churned up the ground, and the wheels of the chariot could easily get stuck. For an army on foot to have any chance against chariots, it was vital to draw them onto unfavourable ground. We should also consider for a moment the difficulty and expense associated with maintaining such a large number of chariots. Each chariot was manned by 3 men, a driver, a shield-bearer who provided protection, and a spear or bowman. He would be the one tasked with doing most of the offensive work. So in terms of personnel, that required a garrison of at least 2,700 men. They all had to be housed and fed. Then we must consider the horses. Each chariot was pulled by 2 horses, so there must have been stables that housed at least 1,800 horses. There would also need to be extra horses to replace those killed or injured in action. Perhaps a further 200 to 300 horses might be required. All of these horses need to be fed, watered and cared for. And let's not forget about the chariots themselves. They would be prone to constant wear and tear. Even if not used in battle, they were needed for training and practice. Wheels would break or be damaged. Reins and straps would wear out. So a team of blacksmiths and workmen would also have been needed. What I'm saying here is that to maintain such a large force required very careful organisation, planning and finances. Still, King Jabin considered it to be worth the high cost, because they gave him a massive advantage on the battlefield. After 20 years of success, he probably thought that he had nothing much to fear from the Israelites. Well, how wrong he was. Let's look at what God had planned for Jabin's impressive army. Deborah was a prophetess of the Lord, so the message that she is imparting to Barak is what God had revealed to her. The message is simple. Barak, her military commander, is to recruit 10,000 men from the tribes of Naphtali and Zebulun. He is then to lead this considerable force to Mount Tabor, where he will meet and defeat Sisera in battle at the river Kishon. The orders are quite clear. Follow God's plans and you will be successful. Well, how does Barak respond? Sadly, not very well. He seems at this time to lack true courage and conviction. He seems to doubt that God will grant him this victory. Given what I've just explained about the power and might of Sisera's chariot army, we might understand his reticence. Even a large force of 10,000 foot soldiers would be no match for 900 chariots. But Barak has forgotten one crucial factor. God is on Israel's side. When the God of the universe is at the head of your army, you cannot be defeated. Barak insists that he will only go on this mission if accompanied by Deborah. There are several ways that we might interpret what he says here. It may demonstrate a high degree of hesitancy or uncertainty. Many read these words and think that Barak lacked real faith. Alternatively, it may indicate that he recognized a certain power and strength in Deborah, that she truly spoke for God. Perhaps he imagined that her talismanic presence would ensure victory. Or maybe he just thought it would be easier to recruit men to fight if she was there to encourage and motivate the men. Whatever the case, Deborah agrees to go, but gives Barak a stark warning. There will be a price to pay for his failure to act as God wanted. The price is that he will be denied the full honour and glory due to one who defeated a strong enemy. Instead, that honour will go to a woman. This must have been very difficult for a powerful Israelite warrior to hear, but a woman will indeed get the glory. Most people reading or hearing this would assume that this woman would be Deborah, but this is not the woman in mind. The woman who would get the glory is the subject of this sermon, Jael. Well, let's turn and look at her next. What do we know about Jael? Well, let's deal firstly with her name. It should properly be pronounced as Jael or Jael. Her name means mountain or wild goat, which is perhaps to us today an odd name choice for a daughter. She is mentioned by name in Scripture 6 times, 4 here in Judges chapter 4 and twice more in Judges chapter 5. We also know that she was the wife of Heber the Kenite, and I will talk more on him in a moment. But aside from that, we know very little about her. But let's skip ahead now to the day of the battle. In verse 11 we are introduced to Jael's husband, Heber the Kenite. The Kenites were the descendants of Moses' father-in-law, Hobab. They had been friends of God's people from the time of Moses, and had even settled in the southern desert region of the Promised Land known as Arad. Heber had broken off from the rest of the Kenites and moved his family north. He settled down near a landmark known as the Oak in Zananim. There is some debate as to whose side Heber was on. Was he pro-Israel, pro-Canaanite, or somewhere in between? It certainly seems to be the case there had been some form of compromise on the part of Heber. We know this because he was at peace with Jabin. This view was not shared, of course, by his wife Jael. She was most definitely pro-Israel, and unlike her husband, was no compromiser. Sisera then learns that Barak and his force of 10,000 men have positioned themselves at Mount Tabor. This mountain, rising to a height of 588 meters, would have given them a great strategic advantage. They would be able to see the enemy approaching from some distance, and it provided them with the benefit of higher ground. It's much more difficult and tiring to attack an enemy that's positioned on a hill. Despite Barak's advantage, Sisera is confident that his superior chariot forces will prevail. He gathers together all the chariots and all the men that he has, and sets off from Harosheth Hagoyim. When they are seen approaching, Deborah gives the command for the army to rise up and prepare for action. This is where we see Barak show true courage and bravery, and this, I believe, is why he is named among the heroes of the faith in Hebrews chapter 11. He led his forces down to face off against the army of Sisera. Let me just emphasize that point. He gave up the advantage of higher ground to go down to flat ground that much better suited the enemy. Imagine the kind of fortitude that this required, to stand virtually unprotected against massed ranks of iron chariots. But Barak at this point in time seems to be trusting that God was really on their side. In verse 15 we read that the Lord routed Sisera and all of his army. From Sisera's viewpoint, the battle was a complete disaster. How, might you ask, was such a thing possible? How could it be that all those state-of-the-art chariots failed so badly? Well, obviously the first thing to say is that with God all things are possible. The Bible is full of God's people achieving improbable victories. We would do well to remember that no human might can stand against the sovereign power of the universe. But God may also have intervened in a slightly different way. In chapter 5 of Judges, we read Deborah and Barak's song of victory. In verses 19 to 21, we read the following. The kings came and fought, then the kings of Canaan fought, in Tanakh by the waters of Megiddo. They took no spoils of silver. They fought from the heavens. The stars from their courses fought against Sisera. The torrent of Kishon swept them away. That ancient torrent, the torrent of Kishon. O my soul, march on in strength. These verses speak of the Kishon River flooding due to a storm accompanied by heavy rainfall. This was divine intervention. As I explained to you before, boggy or muddy ground severely impairs the effectiveness of chariots. So let's try and imagine the scene. The chariots begin their charge until they reach the sodden ground where the Kishon River has flooded. The hooves of the horses soon churn up the wet ground, and the wheels of the chariots become embedded. The chariots are now virtually immobile. All their strategic advantage is lost. Remember, the chariots had 3 occupants, only one of whom is a real fighting man. In such a fight, lightly armed men on foot have all the advantages. Barak and his men can move easily between the chariots, hacking down the Canaanites as they go. It's a complete rout, and Sisera quickly realizes this. He abandons his own chariot to escape on foot. Interestingly, he ran northeast from the battle site, while his remaining soldiers fled back west, the way that they had come. They were all pursued and cut down, and this in itself was unusual. Normally in ancient battles, whilst casualty figures could be high, usually some of the combatants lived to fight another day. But not so in this case. All of Sisera's men perished. Sisera makes his way to the tent of Jael, the wife of Heber, located in Zananim. Heber, as we noted before, had some kind of peace arrangement with King Jabin. Sisera thinks that he has found a place of refuge and safety. This is reinforced as Jael goes out to meet and welcome him. She reassures him by telling him that he has nothing to fear. A brief cultural note here before we move on. What Sisera did here was highly irregular. Upon arriving at the camp, he should have first gone to Heber, the head of the household. To not do this would have been regarded as very rude and a serious slight against Heber. Perhaps he deliberately chose Jael's tent, thinking that those pursuing him would have been unlikely to search for him in a woman's tent. He also should not have accepted Jael's offer of hospitality. It was highly inappropriate, and any man of integrity at that time would have politely declined such an invitation. The fact that he acted in this rather unusual way clearly alerted Jael to the fact that something was not quite right. This wasn't a regular social visit. Once inside, he lies down, and Jael covers him with a rug or blanket. This is more to conceal him rather than to make him feel comfortable. As Sisera settles himself to sleep, he makes two requests of Jael. Firstly, he asks for something to drink. He has come a long way from the scene of the battle, and it is not surprising, therefore, that he would be extremely thirsty. Jael gives him some milk. It was probably a kind of yogurt or curdled milk called leben. Some have speculated that she chose this particular drink because it was more likely to make him feel drowsy. A glass of wine tends to perk up the spirits. No doubt Sisera was thirsty, but there may also have been an ulterior motive behind his request for a drink. Ancient Middle Eastern hospitality included protection for guests, and this was enacted when the host shared food or drink. According to social customs, offering a guest food was a solemn vow not to harm them. So was his subtle asking for a drink really a way of trying to ensure her protection? Secondly, he asked that she stand guard at the entrance of the tent. He is exhausted after battle and flight. He knows that his weariness will soon overwhelm him and that he will fall asleep. So whilst he sleeps, if anyone comes along and asks about him, she is to lie about his presence. Doing this would have greatly endangered her safety. If Deborah or Barak had found out that she hid an enemy, they would have punished her accordingly. So Sisera was actually a very rude and inconsiderate guest. What happens next, though, is both shocking and surprising. It's one of those passages that we read and then stop and wonder if we really have read it right. Part of its surprise factor comes from the fact that it is such a complete reversal of what we might expect. We might expect that Sisera, as a brutish warrior, would force himself upon Jael, that he would dominate, control, or even rape her. Perhaps this was what she feared. But this was not how things played out. She had no intention of letting this enemy of her people rest and then escape. It's also shocking because her methods of dispatching Sisera are so incredibly brutal. Let's pause for a moment to talk about murder. I bet you've never heard a pastor say that during the middle of a sermon. As I'm sure you are aware, murders are most often committed by men. I recently read an interesting report on murders in Sweden between 1990 and 2010. The study considered 1,570 incidents. The findings showed that 90% of Swedish homicides were committed by men, and just 10% of murders were carried out by women. When it came to evaluating the methods murderers chose to kill their victims, something very interesting emerged. The report revealed that women's murdering habits were very different to men's. Men more often used blunt objects, such as hammers work tools or bats. Men also favoured using firearms if these were available. What about women? What were their preferred weapons of choice? Are you ready? Women, it was discovered, more often used a sharp object to kill. Isn't that interesting? Well, let's look at what Jael used to kill Sisera. The object that she used to kill Sisera was indeed a sharp object. In this case, a tent peg. The kind of tent peg in view here was a sharp wooden spike, about 30 centimetres in length and about 25 millimetres in diameter. Why, you might ask, did she choose this particular item? Wasn't there something more suitable to hand? A sharp knife, for example. Well, Jael knew how to handle a tent peg because it was customarily the work of women to set up the tents. She was then very familiar with how to hold, hit and drive them hard into the ground. As soon as the general had fallen asleep, Jael sneaks up to him with a tent peg and a wooden hammer. She finds the perfect place to pierce the man's head. This was probably the soft spot on the side of the skull, between the eye, ear and forehead. She then hammers the spike through the general's skull and into the ground below. It's unlikely that she had the strength to do this with one single blow. As horrible as it sounds, she probably had to hit the peg several times. As one commentary that I looked at neatly put it, Sisera died of a splitting headache. As brutal as all that sounds, it was probably a very quick death. The episode concludes with the arrival of Barak. He has been hotly pursuing the enemy. As he approaches the encampment, Jael goes out to meet him. She beckons him to come and she will show him the man he seeks. He's lying in the tent, nailed to the ground through the head. I'm sure that it slightly shocked Barak, who had probably seen his fair share of death. We should not overlook the irony and the humour here. Barak, a mighty warrior leader, is being told to go by Deborah and to come by Jael. No doubt he was usually the one giving the orders. Furthermore, as Deborah had predicted, he will not get the honour and glory of capturing or killing the enemy leader. That honour will go to a humble housewife. Following this, God enabled the people of Israel to subdue King Jabin, to the point where he no longer posed a threat to their well-being. This process may well have taken several years. Interestingly, this is the last record in Scripture of the Canaanites oppressing Israel militarily. However, their religious practices would continue to ensnare God's people from time to time. And so as we come to the conclusion of our account of Jael, a woman who appears briefly in just 2 chapters of the Bible, a woman that in truth we know very little about. Aside from this one act of brutal courage, she remains a figure shrouded in mystery. Despite this, we can look at what Scripture tells us and learn some valuable lessons. Well, let's consider what we can learn from our unlikely hero, Jael. I have 4 lessons that we can learn from the life of Jael. Number 1. Seizing opportunities. As Jael went about her daily chores in and around the nomad camp on that fateful day, she could hardly have been anticipating what would happen. How could she possibly have guessed that the most bitter enemy of her people would come literally knocking at the tent door to ask for help? I bet she could hardly believe it. What a wonderful opportunity she was afforded, but how easily it might have been spurned or wasted. Jael, however, showed great composure and calmness. She didn't panic or overreact. Such a reaction might have startled Sisera and caused him to leave. Instead, she carefully and deliberately lulled him into a sense of safety. What an important lesson this is for us today. God grants us many opportunities to do a variety of things. He manoeuvres people into your life who need to hear the gospel. At other times he brings people into your orbit who need wise Christian counsel or wisdom. Depending on your skills or abilities, he might provide an opportunity for you to teach or preach, or even to serve as a missionary. How are we to respond when such opportunities occur? Hopefully, just like Jael, we respond with composure and calmness. Sadly, I doubt this is often the case. Isn't the truth that we too often let precious opportunities just slip away? We could speak to that friend, colleague, or family member and share the gospel, but we don't quite feel ready. We're too shy, too tired, or too busy, and the opportunity is forever lost. So let's pray for boldness and courage that we can act when an opportunity arises. Number 2, not being fearful about getting our hands dirty. One of the many criticisms levelled against the British military command during the First World War was that they were just too distant from the action. Whilst the troops suffered the horrors of the trenches, the majors and generals lived comfortably in nice accommodation many miles behind the front lines. They lost the respect of the common soldiers because they were not willing to get their hands dirty. When Sisera turned up at her tent, Jael had to decide what to do. She could have run and told her husband Heber or another male relative or tribe member. However, given the agreement that existed, they might easily have allowed Sisera to go free. Therefore, Jael really had no choice. She had to literally get her hands bloody. Naturally, this was most unpleasant, but this act ultimately broke the dominance of the Canaanites and led her people to be free of their oppression. As I may have said to you before, Christianity isn't a spectator sport. It's not something that we can sit back and watch from afar. We are expected as servants to work for the kingdom. God expects that we get our hands dirty for him. Some Christians today may be fearful, and if you live in a place where you face persecution, I can understand that fear. But certainly here in Korea and in the Western world, too many Christians, I'm afraid, are just lazy and uncommitted. Getting your hands dirty, whether that means volunteering at church, helping the poor and homeless, or going on missions, just seems like too much hard work. Let us all pray that we will not be afraid to get our hands dirty when necessary. Number 3, using the tools and skills that we have been given. As we saw in our story today, when it came time to do her work, Jael reached for a tool. The tool she deliberately reached for was a tent peg. This was because it was her job to set up and take down the tents. She had a skill in setting and driving home the spikes that kept the tent erect. So in other words, she used what she knew and was comfortable in using. She used the resources given to her in this situation by God. She didn't waste a moment thinking, "Oh, if only I had a sword or a knife of some kind." She simply took up the tools at hand and did what was being asked of her. God equips his people for the work that he puts in front of them. He gives us certain skills and gifts for a reason, and we should always be on the lookout for ways to use them. Number 4, knowing that obeying God may require breaking conventions or cultural norms. The rules surrounding hospitality in the ancient world were incredibly important. A guest that you had invited to eat with you was supposed to be under your safe protection. Many at that time would have regarded what Jael did as a major act of treachery. Murdering a guest was simply unthinkable. We should remember, however, that this was at a time of war. This means that the regular way of behaving was temporarily suspended. We should also remember that Jael acted on behalf of her people. She broke the cultural conventions of her day, but for a very good reason. It's a lesson that we should learn from today. There may be occasions when obeying God requires us to break the conventions or the other cultural norms of our times. In Korea, that might mean refusing to take part in after-work drinking sessions, standing firm against the pressure to join in ancestor worship, or just not going along with the ungodly thinking or practices of today. To do this, of course, is not always easy. We may face anger and hostility for standing firm. But if we do so, we should remember that obeying God and living lives that please Him should always be our primary concern.
When Ehud was dead, the children of Israel again did evil in the sight of the Lord. So the Lord sold them into the hand of Jabin, king of Canaan, who reigned in Hazor. The commander of his army was Sisera, who dwelt in Harosheth Hagoyim. And the children of Israel cried out to the Lord, for Jabin had 900 chariots of iron, and for 20 years he had harshly oppressed the children of Israel. Now Deborah, a prophetess, the wife of Lapidath, was judging Israel at that time. And she would sit under the palm tree of Deborah, between Ramah and Bethel, in the mountains of Ephraim. And the children of Israel came up to her for judgment. Then she sent and called for Barak, the son of Abinoam, from Kedesh in Naphtali.
Has not the Lord God of Israel commanded? Go and deploy troops at Mount Tabor. Take with you 10,000 men of the sons of Naphtali and of the sons of Zebulun. And against you I will deploy Sisera, the commander of Jabin's army, with his chariots and his multitude at the river Kishon, and I will deliver him into your hand.
And Barak said to her,
If you will go with me, then I will go. But if you will not go with me, I will not go.
I will surely go with you. Nevertheless, there will be no glory for you in the journey you are taking, for the Lord will sell Sisera into the hand of a woman.
Then Deborah arose and went with Barak to Kedesh. And Barak called Zebulun and Naphtali to Kedesh. He went up with 10,000 men under his command, and Deborah went up with him. Now Heber the Kenite, of the children of Hobab, the father-in-law of Moses, had separated himself from the Kenites, and pitched his tent near the terebinth tree at Zaanaim, which is beside Kedesh. And they reported to Sisera that Barak, the son of Abinoam, had gone up to Mount Tabor. So Sisera gathered together all his chariots, 900 chariots of iron, and all the people who were with him, from Harosheth Hagoyim to the river Kishon. Then Deborah said to Barak,
Up, for this is the day in which the Lord has delivered Sisera into your hand. Has not the Lord gone out before you?
So Barak went down from Mount Tabor with 10,000 men following him. And the Lord routed Sisera and all his chariots and all his army with the edge of the sword before Barak. And Sisera alighted from his chariot and fled away on foot. But Barak pursued the chariots and the army as far as Harosheth Hagoyim. And all the army of Sisera fell by the edge of the sword. Not a man was left. However, Sisera had fled away on foot to the tent of Jael, the wife of Heber the Kenite. For there was peace between Jabin, king of Hazor, and the house of Heber the Kenite. And Jael went out to meet Sisera, and said to him,
Turn aside, my lord. Turn aside to me. Do not fear.
And when he had turned aside with her into the tent, she covered him with a blanket.
Please, give me a little water to drink, for I am thirsty.
So she opened a jug of milk, gave him a drink, and covered him.
Stand at the door of the tent, and if any man comes and inquires of you, and says, Is there any man here? You shall say no.
Then Jael, Heber's wife, took a tent peg and took a hammer in her hand and went softly to him and drove the peg into his temple. And he went down into the ground, for he was fast asleep and weary. So he died. And then, as Barak pursued Sisera, Jael came out to meet him.
Come, I will show you the man whom you seek.
And when he went into her tent, there lay Sisera, dead, with the peg in his temple. So on that day God subdued Jabin, king of Canaan, in the presence of the children of Israel. And the hand of the children of Israel grew stronger and stronger against Jabin, king of Canaan, until they had destroyed Jabin, king of Canaan.